This is the 6th week in our series on Celtic Christian spirituality. I'm going to be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 13. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of these is love. We used to think, and we still, many of us do, that babies have to be taught how to sleep. Parents are admonished to don't let that baby cry, let that baby cry it out, or you'll spoil that baby. And some parents are told, have the baby sleep in the room with you so the baby mimics your sleep patterns. There's a ton of advice, and none of it is accurate or useful. Because most babies do not even develop distinguishable sleep patterns until the age of 1. Their brains aren't ready yet. The sleep patterns in babies emerge over time. Forcing something to emerge earlier than biologically possible is pointless and painful for parent and progeny alike. Sleeping in the first months is totally random. And any of us who've raised a child know that's true. At 4 months, an initial cycle looks like it's emerging. There's a hint of a pattern at 8 months. By 12 months, a clear sleeping pattern emerges among almost all babies. I learned this on a Netflix documentary called Babies. And throughout the series, many assumptions that we continue to hold about how babies develop and how they should therefore be handled are false. I learned a few things. I had to unlearn a few things. It's hard to unlearn things that we once held to be true. I used to take for granted phrases like, Jesus died for my sins. It was just something people said. My religious upbringing was not focused on Jesus as a sacrifice, as an atonement for sin. The notion of Jesus dying for sins was more background noise than primary purpose in the Methodist and Disciple church I grew up in. The purpose of Jesus was to teach us how to live and how to love. It was as a young adult that those phrases started to sound nonsensical to me. I stopped simply accepting them at face value, parroting what I had heard. God the Father of Jesus, who plans his son death, sounds like an abusive parent to me. Paul wrote, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I grew up, I put an end to childish ways." My reason and my thinking, they were growing up. But there was no language and no expression inside the church I knew for something other than what had become a party line. Now, our denomination is decidedly not doctrinaire. We ascribe only to this, that Jesus is the Christ. But the doctrines and the dogma of the historical church, they get lived out in our hearing and in our living all the same. In our series on Celtic Christian spiritual tradition, we've explored the doctrine of original sin for one. Well, it's neither original and nor is it redemptive. Another like it is substitutionary atonement. Atonement doctrine depends on original sin. We all have to be born irredeemable, bad, in order for atonement to be necessary. They work hand in glove. The thinking goes like this: Jesus paid it all. Paid for what? For the forgiveness of sins. And how was that payment made? He died on the cross. So, God requires death for forgiveness, is how this thinking goes. The Father of Jesus sends his Son to be executed, so the rest of us go off scot-free. I think that's abusive. That's what I call an abusive parent. And as the author of our book that we're reading questions, what cosmic legal system is in play here, and who created it? We are so incapable of making a worthy payment, a sacrifice for our sin, this thinking goes, which is original apparently. So a substitute is made. The doctrine of substitutionary atonement turns the notions of forgiveness and grace into bloody accomplishments, achievements, instead of the sacred gifts they are. The doctrine of substitutionary atonement is magical thinking. Someone's brutal execution delivers people from the punishment they supposedly deserve. Jesus pays a ransom for people by dying on a cross. It's very transactional. It turns Jesus into this escape plan. And Jesus is an engagement plan with life, not an escape plan from it. All theology is contextual. All theology is formed by experience, by the frame of people's experience. The context for the doctrine of substitutionary atonement finds its first expression in the early church, in the writings of Origen, who believed Jesus' death was a ransom paid to the Satan for the souls of humanity as a result of their inherited sin. Hashtag see original sin. These notions perpetuate that what is at the heart of God is judgment, not love. This punitive approach has been normalized in law in so-called Christian nations. When a wrong is done, someone has to pay. Now, certainly, people should be held accountable for hurt that they cause to another person. But our own penal system has turned into a punitive, racially biased system in which people are simply made more unfit to be part of society. Our own penal system houses vast numbers of people who suffer from mental illness, about 25% of the prison population. What we are doing doesn't make any sense unless we plan to pay for people to be locked up for the rest of their lives. Judgment in and by itself has no power to profoundly change us. Well, it can frighten and inhibit us, but it cannot transform us. Only love transforms us. For only love has the power to change our hearts. And love takes tremendous courage. We celebrated the life of Janice Robinson, newborn, yesterday. And she was someone who was so courageous. She didn't ask to be a trailblazer, but her entire professional career as an African-American woman working inside and outside the church, that's just what her life became. And she did it with tremendous love and transformed a lot of lives and the landscape of our denomination. There are alternate views of the death of Jesus, his suffering, and the cross event. These theological views are also formed out of people's experience. Armenian Christians, for instance, have a very different view of the crucifixion, coming out of the 1915 Armenian genocide perpetrated by the country of Turkey. Archbishop Kajag Barsamian, the primate of the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of North America, preached in his 2005 Easter sermon this: Armenian Christians should be clear on this point. Our church does not regard the shedding of Christ's blood as a necessary condition of salvation. We do not conceive of Christ as some kind of human sacrifice or scapegoat whose humiliation purchased salvation for humankind. Christ's death was God's way of standing shoulder to shoulder with all the deaths that had gone before, and of anticipating those that would come after. The scars we still bear today, the losses we have endured, whether inflicted 90 years ago, 25 years, 10, 5, or even last night, Christ has borne before us, borne them in anticipation of our own afflictions, borne them out of his love for us in triumph as well as in tragedy. A Jesuit priest named John Zabrino, known for his writings in liberation theology, put it this way: the cross does not offer us any explanatory model that would make us understand what salvation is. Instead, it invites us to participate in a process within which we can actually experience history as salvation. God longs for union with all of creation, including us. If that were not the case, if God did not long for union with us, a payment would probably be required to get into God's club. Instead, Celtic Christian teachers like a man named Alred, who lived in 12th century northern England, and others like him, kept this voice, this spirit alive in the church, taught that Christ is not a ransom for our soul, but Christ is companion of our soul, shoulder to shoulder with us. Jesus' suffering and death on a cross was a public execution. The cross was the ancient version of an electric chair, a noose, or a hypodermic needle. Now, can you imagine wearing one of those around your neck? Jesus' suffering and death on a cross was very real, horrific, tragic. For me, that suffering and that horror is not where my salvation lies. I don't need Jesus to die on a cross for God to love me. The tragic death of Jesus has more meaning for me than some simplistic notion that a ransom has been paid. It is a reminder for me that innocence is often ignored, that innocence is often violently and purposefully put down. It is a reminder that when we seek to amplify the love of God in the world, there will be resistance. There will be even consequences, perhaps even violent consequences. Like the Armenian bishop preached, it's God's way of standing shoulder to shoulder with us in the struggle, in the suffering, and even in the violence. We all want to be there when the suffering ends, to celebrate. We all want to be there when the triumph comes, when the addiction ceases, when the job is granted, when racism is healed. But to get there, we got to do the work. We got to stand shoulder to shoulder with the ones who suffer. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder with the suffering of this world into which God sends us and into which Christ calls us. Amen.